It's spooky season, so I went to Salem. Here's me with the witch house. And I went to the visitor center and I asked about the town's black history. The guy behind the desk looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Oh, that's in Boston." So I was like, "No, friend. Black people existed everywhere and I want to know what they did in Salem." "Why?" "Hi, I'm Angela. I'm a professor. I wrote a book on slavery, and my job has taught me that black people's history is the first to be erased anywhere, so it's usually the first thing I look for everywhere I go when I travel." Now, fortunately, the National Park Service did have my back. Kind of, anyway. They had collected some research about the black presence in Salem, and so I spent the day tracking down all of the sites associated with prominent black figures in Salem, Massachusetts. And I know what you're thinking, right? Like, Salem is the place where Christian fundamentalists falsely accused, mostly women, of witchcraft and publicly tortured and executed them. And yes, that's interesting in a horrible sort of I live in the South and I see this coming in the future if things go to hell in November kind of way. But beyond the witch trials, Salem is home to some really subversive black people who changed the course of all of our history. And this month, I'm going to do a series of talks to tell you all about them, so hold on to your brooms. Now, number one, of course, is Tituba, Salem's most well-known black woman because of her ties to the Salem witch trials. And no, that is not what she looked like, of course. So as the most common sort of story goes is that Tituba was an enslaved woman from the West Indies who was purchased by a Puritan who forced her to look after his daughters. When the witch hysteria overtook Salem, those two girls implicated Tituba, and in 1693 she was brought in front of a grand jury for witchcraft. Unlike the white Puritans who were accused, Tituba understood the nature of the enslavers around her, and she said what she had to save herself. She confessed and repented and escaped the death penalty. And after her stint in prison, she was sold away from Salem and she disappears from the historic record. Later, of course, we find out more details from women scholars who examined this more closely using a gender and a racial lens. And from them, we find out that she was from Venezuela, most likely indigenous, and sold to a planter in Barbados. So I like to look at the date, right? 1693. And what else was going on at the time? After all, Tituba had spent most of her life in South America and in the Caribbean, a melting pot of all cultures and all empires. And do you know what else was going on in the 1680s and 1690s in the places that Tituba lived? Yeah, it was the height of the Inquisition in the Spanish and Portuguese American colonies. So we know that initially the Inquisition came out of the 1400s, right, and targeted Jewish people and anyone else who deviated from Catholic doctrine in the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world. But over time, certainly by the 1600s, the Inquisition became a mechanism of control, especially over Black and Indigenous people, especially women, right? So you see where I'm going with this? In the Spanish American colonies, including Venezuela, where Tituba was from, the Inquisition was a legal way for officials to get rid of powerful Africans and indigenous people. It was used as a mechanism to destroy matriarchal societies and women-based beliefs that came out of West Africa and several of the indigenous tribes of the Americas. Everyone who didn't take on Spanish culture was at risk of being identified, accused, tortured, and possibly executed. So when Salem came under witch hysteria, my guess, and several other scholars' guesses, is that Tituba saw the writing on the wall, right? The latest scholarship indicates that she understood exactly what to say. Confess early, confess often, and repent in a way that upholds Puritan values and perceptions surrounding gender, race, religion, and the status of enslavement. Right, Tituba, someone who was likely multiracial, multicultural, multilingual, and had lived in several nations and empires in her lifetime, she played the Puritans. Now, why does that matter? Historian Elaine Breslaw says that, and I quote, "Tituba created a new idiom of resistance by overtly submitting to the will of her abuser while covertly feeding his fears of conspiracy." In other words, instead of trying to fix the situation, explaining herself, trying to help these Puritan numbskulls understand the hysteria that she had likely already seen in the Inquisition back in Venezuela or in Barbados or in any of the other places that she had traveled, she chose herself, right? She picked herself. That's a lesson right there. And in doing so, she ramped up their witch hysteria that eventually they used to destroy themselves from within, right? And because of that, right, because the rest of the nation was horrified to hear what had happened in Salem, because Salem had destroyed itself from within, more Americans began to appreciate and call for separation of church and state. They also called for legal reforms to make sure that fundamentalist Christian leaders cannot keep someone from legal representation or the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, right? So, thanks, Tituba. Stay tuned for more of these, maybe follow, because I've got a whole list of people to talk about from Salem, Massachusetts.